In the small, sleepy town of Millfield, Ohio, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. People knew each other by name, and everyone had their own little routines that made the days feel comfortable and familiar. Among these residents was an elderly man who had become something of a local legend. He was a retired Army veteran, a man with a heart as big as his stories about serving in Vietnam. His neighbors often saw him tending to his garden or sitting on his porch, sipping coffee while sharing wisdom with any young person willing to listen. This man, known affectionately by everyone as Jimmy, wasn't just another face in the crowd. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, earned through years of service to his country. After leaving the military, he dedicated his time to helping others, whether it was mentoring kids at the community center or fixing fences for elderly neighbors. Jimmy always found ways to make life better for those around him. To many, he was more than a neighbor. He was a pillar of strength and kindness in their lives. But one crisp autumn morning, the calm rhythm of Millfield was shattered. The sun had barely risen when the sound of screeching tires broke the stillness. Two police cruisers came to a sudden halt outside Jimmy's modest home. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, curiosity turning into alarm as officers jumped out of the cars, their movements tense and hurried. Without knocking or announcing themselves, they barged through Jimmy's front door, guns drawn. Inside, Jimmy was going about his usual morning routine. Dressed in nothing but an old bathrobe, he froze in disbelief as the officers stormed into his living room. Their voices were loud and sharp, barking questions he couldn't fully understand. Before he could even process what was happening, cold metal handcuffs snapped around his wrists. "Illegal firearms possession," one of the officers growled, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Jimmy's mind raced. Firearms? What were they talking about? He hadn't touched a weapon since his days in the Army, yet here he was, being treated like some kind of dangerous criminal. As he stood there, bewildered and humiliated, his neighbors watched from behind their curtains, their faces etched with confusion and concern. How could this gentle man, someone they trusted and admired, be involved in something so serious? The scene grew more chaotic as the officers searched the house. They rummaged through drawers, overturned furniture, and tore apart closets, leaving a trail of disarray in their wake. Jimmy tried to protest, explaining that he didn't know anything about illegal weapons, but his words fell on deaf ears. Within minutes, he was led out of his home, his hands cuffed behind his back, his bare feet shuffling awkwardly against the cold pavement. As the squad car pulled away, carrying Jimmy to the station, two unmarked black SUVs arrived silently on the scene. Out stepped men and women dressed in dark suits, their expressions unreadable. One of them flashed a badge marked FBI to the remaining officers, who exchanged uncertain glances. Whatever was happening here, it was clear that things were about to get much more complicated. Back at the station, Jimmy sat alone in a cold, sterile interrogation room. His mind swirled with questions. Why was this happening? Who could have set him up? And why did the FBI suddenly show up? For now, all he could do was wait, and hope that the truth would come to light before it was too late. The interrogation room felt colder than Jimmy expected. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh glow on the metal table in front of him. His hands were still cuffed, and he shifted uncomfortably in the hard plastic chair. Every now and then he glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking echoing loudly in the silence. It had been nearly an hour since they brought him here, but no one had said a word to him since he arrived. Finally, the door swung open, and Detective Mark Harris walked in. He was a tall man with a stern face and sharp eyes that seemed to bore into Jimmy as he dropped a thick folder onto the table. The detective didn't sit down. Instead, he stood over Jimmy, his arms crossed, radiating authority. Or maybe it was just intimidation. "You want to tell me how these ended up in your house?" Harris asked, his voice low but firm. He opened the folder and flipped through some photos before slamming one down in front of Jimmy. The picture showed several military-grade rifles, neatly arranged on a dusty basement floor. They looked menacing, even in the photograph. Jimmy stared at the image, his brow furrowing. "I don't know anything about those," he said slowly, shaking his head. "They're not mine." Harris leaned forward, resting both hands on the table. Come on, old man, don't play dumb with me. These were found under the floorboards in your basement. You really expect me to believe you didn't put them there? Jimmy's heart sank. Under the floorboards? That part of the basement hadn't been touched in months. He'd been dealing with knee pain ever since surgery earlier in the year, and climbing the stairs to the basement was already difficult enough. Even if he wanted to hide something, which he absolutely did not, he wouldn't have chosen such an inconvenient spot. I'm telling you the truth, Jimmy insisted, his voice rising slightly despite his best efforts to stay calm. Someone must have planted them there. I haven't been down there in weeks. Harris narrowed his eyes, studying Jimmy's face for any sign of deception. For a moment, the room fell silent except for the hum of the lights above. Then, without another word, the detective straightened up and turned toward the door. Just as he reached for the handle, though, it opened from the other side. A woman stepped in, her presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. She wore a dark suit and carried herself with quiet confidence. Her badge gleamed as she held it up briefly before slipping it back into her pocket. Special Agent Rachel Klein, she introduced herself, her tone calm but commanding. Unlike Harris, she took a seat across from Jimmy, placing a thin file on the table between them. For a moment, Jimmy wasn't sure what to think. Was this good news or bad? Harris lingered by the door, clearly unhappy about being interrupted. But Klein ignored him completely. She opened her file and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. On it was a grainy black and white photo taken from a security camera. It showed someone entering Jimmy's backyard late at night, their face partially obscured by shadows. This person broke into your home 2 nights ago, Klein explained, pointing to the figure in the photo. We believe they're connected to a larger operation we've been tracking, a smuggling ring moving illegal weapons across state lines. Jimmy blinked, trying to process what she was saying. Wait, so someone broke into my house and hid those guns there? Why would they do that? Klein hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Because of who you are, she said finally. Your background makes you an easy target. Whoever planted those weapons knew law enforcement would assume you were involved because of your military history. They counted on us jumping to conclusions. Jimmy sat back in his chair, stunned. It all sounded so absurd, like something out of a movie. But deep down he knew it made sense. People often assumed things about him based on his past. Things that weren't true. Now, someone had exploited that assumption to frame him for a crime he didn't commit. As Klein continued explaining the situation, Detective Harris grew increasingly agitated. You can't seriously be buying this, he muttered, pacing near the door. He's lying. He has to be. But Klein remained unfazed. We'll see, she replied coolly. Turning back to Jimmy, she added, There's one more thing. Do you recognize this person? She tapped the photo again, zooming in slightly on the intruder's face. Jimmy squinted at the image, leaning closer to get a better look. At first, he thought it might be a stranger, but then something clicked. The shape of the jawline, the way the person moved, it was familiar. Too familiar. Slowly, recognition dawned on him, and his stomach churned with a mix of anger and sadness. Yes, he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I know who that is. Klein nodded, unsurprised by his reaction. Good, because whoever this is, they're neck-deep in trouble. And if you want to clear your name, you're going to have to help us bring them down. The weight of her words hit Jimmy like a punch to the gut. Helping the FBI meant betraying someone he once cared about deeply, but staying silent meant taking the fall for crimes he didn't commit. As he sat there, torn between loyalty and self-preservation, one thing became painfully clear. His life would never be the same again. Jimmy's mind raced as he stared at the blurry image on the table. The face in the photo was unmistakable now, even though it had been years since he'd last seen it. Memories flooded back, good ones and bad ones, moments of laughter and arguments that ended in slammed doors. He felt a lump rise in his throat. How could this person, someone he once cared for so deeply, betray him like this? Agent Klein watched him closely, her expression calm but probing. She didn't rush him. Instead, she let the silence stretch, giving Jimmy time to process what he was seeing. Finally, she broke the quiet. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked gently, her tone softer than before. Jimmy sighed, rubbing his temples with his cuffed hands. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "I know who it is, but I don't understand why they would do something like this, why they would drag me into their mess." Klein nodded, leaning forward slightly. "Sometimes people get desperate," she said, "especially when they're involved in things they can't control. Maybe they thought you wouldn't suspect them, or maybe they were counting on your reputation to make you look guilty." Her words stung, but Jimmy couldn't deny they made sense. Over the years, he'd tried to stay out of trouble, living a quiet life focused on helping others. Who would ever think to question him? That's exactly what made him the perfect scapegoat. Detective Harris, still hovering by the door, scoffed loudly. "This is nonsense," he muttered under his breath. "He's probably lying to save his own skin." Klein shot him a sharp glance, silencing him instantly. Then, turning back to Jimmy, she continued, "Look, I'm not here to judge you or anyone else. My job is to find out who's responsible for bringing those weapons into your home. If you want to clear your name, and I assume you do, you need to help us figure out what's really going on." Jimmy swallowed hard. He knew she was right. Sitting there, feeling trapped between his past and the accusations against him, he realized he didn't have much of a choice. If he wanted to prove his innocence, he had to cooperate. But that didn't make the decision any easier. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next hour, Agent Klein laid out a plan. She explained that the person in the photo was part of a larger operation, a group smuggling illegal weapons across state lines. This wasn't just some small-time crime. It was organized and dangerous. And now, thanks to Jimmy's connection to the suspect, the FBI saw an opportunity to catch them. "We need to set up a meeting," Klein said. "A controlled situation where we can gather evidence and make arrests. You'll be key to making that happen." Jimmy frowned, his stomach twisting at the thought. "You want me to contact them? Pretend everything's fine?" Klein nodded. "Exactly. We'll monitor every step. You won't be alone and we'll keep you safe. But we need your help to draw them out." The idea terrified Jimmy. Reaching out to this person, not just because of the risk but because of the memories it would stir up, felt like opening an old wound. Still, he understood there was no other way. If he wanted to protect himself and his community, he had to play along. Later that evening, Jimmy sat in a small office at the FBI field office, staring at a burner phone on the desk in front of him. The device felt foreign in his hand, its weight heavier than it should have been. Across the room, Agent Klein and another agent stood by, listening intently as Jimmy dialed the number. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. Jimmy's heart pounded as he heard the familiar voice on the other end. For a split second, he considered hanging up, but then he remembered the guns in his basement, the handcuffs cutting into his wrists earlier that day, and the neighbors, watching as he was led away in shame. He took a deep breath and spoke. "It's me," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "We need to talk." There was a pause on the other end. Then cautiously the voice replied. "About
what?"
Jimmy hesitated, glancing at Klein, who gave him an encouraging nod. "About the stuff you left at my place. It's not safe anymore. Someone's asking questions." Another pause. This time the voice sounded nervous. "What are you talking about? I didn't leave anything there." Jimmy clenched his jaw. "Don't play games with me. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Meet me tomorrow night at the old warehouse on Pine Street. Bring the rest of it, and we'll sort this out." The line went silent for a moment. Then reluctantly the voice agreed. "Fine, but if this is a trap—" "It's not," Jimmy interrupted quickly. "Just be there." With that, he hung up. His hands were shaking as he placed the phone back on the desk. Across the room, Agent Klein gave him a small, approving smile. "Good work," she said. Now we wait. As the hours ticked by, Jimmy struggled to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the face in the photo, heard the voice on the phone. He replayed the conversation over and over in his head, wondering if he'd said too much or not enough. What if the person realized it was a setup? What if they decided not to show up? But more than anything, Jimmy wrestled with guilt. No matter how angry he was, no matter how betrayed he felt, the truth was that this person had once meant something to him. They'd shared meals, laughed together, leaned on each other during tough times. Thinking about them now, tangled up in something so dark and dangerous, broke his heart. The next morning, the FBI team briefed him again. They went over every detail of the plan, the location, the timing, the signals he should use if something went wrong. Agents would be hiding nearby, ready to move in at a moment's notice. Jimmy nodded along, trying to focus, but his mind kept wandering. By late afternoon, the tension in the air was palpable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, Jimmy climbed into an unmarked van with 2 agents. The drive to the warehouse felt endless, each bump in the road jolting him further out of his thoughts. When they finally arrived, the building loomed ahead, its windows dark and broken, its walls covered in graffiti. Jimmy stepped out of the van, clutching a duffel bag filled with fake evidence provided by the FBI. His heart was pounding as he walked toward the entrance, the cool night air biting at his skin. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint hum of insects and the rustle of leaves in the wind. But otherwise, the world seemed eerily quiet. Inside the warehouse, he waited, the seconds stretching into minutes, just as doubt began creeping. A car pulled up outside. Headlights swept across the cracked concrete floor as a figure emerged from the shadows. Jimmy's breath caught in his throat. For a brief moment, their eyes met. And in that instant, Jimmy saw it. The flicker of guilt, the hint of regret, but there was no time to dwell on it. Before either of them could speak, the FBI agents moved in, surrounding the intruder and shouting orders. As the scene unfolded around him, Jimmy stood frozen, watching as the person who had betrayed him was taken into custody. Relief washed over him, but it was tinged with sadness. Justice had been served, but at what cost? The warehouse was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling. Shadows danced across the cracked walls as Jimmy stood there, clutching the duffel bag tightly in his hands. His heart pounded, so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of wind outside, felt like it was amplified tenfold. He had never been more aware of how fragile life could be. When the car pulled up outside, its headlights cutting through the darkness, Jimmy's breath caught in his throat. The engine cut off, and for a moment, everything went quiet. Then, footsteps echoed on the gravel outside. Slow and deliberate, they approached the entrance of the warehouse. Jimmy's grip tightened on the bag. He told himself to stay calm, to remember that the FBI agents were watching, ready to step in at any moment. But no amount of reassurance could fully silence the storm brewing inside him. The figure stepped into view, silhouetted against the faint glow of the headlights behind them. For a split second, Jimmy froze. It wasn't just the sight of this person. It was the weight of everything they represented. Memories came rushing back, unbidden and overwhelming. There were times when this person had leaned on him, trusted him, needed him, and now here they were standing in front of him under completely different circumstances. Betrayal didn't even begin to cover it. "Where's the stuff?" the voice asked sharply, breaking the tense silence. It was colder than Jimmy remembered, edged with suspicion and fear. Jimmy hesitated, forcing himself to focus. This wasn't about old memories or shared history anymore. It was about doing what had to be done. "It's right here," he said, holding up the duffel bag. His voice sounded steadier than he expected, though his insides were churning. The figure took a cautious step forward, their eyes darting around the room. They weren't stupid. They knew something wasn't quite right. But desperation can make people reckless. "Let me see it," they demanded, reaching out toward the bag, and then without warning, chaos erupted. From the shadows, FBI agents emerged, weapons drawn, surrounding the intruder in seconds. "Federal agents, hands where we can see them," one of the agents barked, their voice commanding and authoritative. The figure froze, hands halfway to the bag. For a brief moment, panic flashed across their face. Then slowly, reluctantly, they raised their hands above their head. "This is a mistake," they protested, their voice trembling. "I don't know anything about those guns." Jimmy watched silently as the agents moved in, cuffing the person and reading them their rights. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was stand there, feeling the crushing weight of everything that had led to this moment. Justice was being served, yes, but it didn't feel like a victory. Not even close. Later that night, after the dust had settled and the suspect was taken away, Jimmy found himself sitting alone in the back of an FBI van. The adrenaline that had kept him going during the sting operation was fading fast, leaving him drained and hollow. Agent Klein climbed into the van beside him, offering a small smile. "You did good tonight," she said softly. "This wouldn't have happened without you." Jimmy nodded absently, staring at the floor. "Yeah," he muttered, "but at what cost?" Klein didn't answer right away. She let the question hang in the air, giving Jimmy space to process everything. Finally, she spoke. "Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't feel good. That doesn't mean it's not worth it." Her words offered little comfort. Jimmy knew she was right, but that didn't make it easier. As the van pulled away from the warehouse, he glanced out the window at the darkened streets of Millfield. The town looked peaceful, almost serene, completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded just moments ago. Life would go on for everyone else, but Jimmy knew things would never be the same for him. Back home the next day, Jimmy tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. He watered his garden, swept his porch, and brewed a pot of coffee. But none of it brought him the peace he usually found in these simple tasks. His mind kept drifting back to the events of the past few days. The arrest, the interrogation, the betrayal. Each memory felt like a fresh wound, reopening every time he thought about it. That evening he sat at his kitchen table, flipping through old photographs. One picture caught his eye, a faded snapshot of him and the person who had betrayed him, smiling together years ago. Back then, life had seemed so much simpler. Neither of them could have imagined how far apart their paths would take them. As Jimmy held the photo, tears welled up in his eyes. He wasn't crying out of anger or bitterness, but out of sadness. Sadness for the bond that had been broken, for the trust that had been shattered. And maybe, just maybe, sadness for the choices that had led both of them to this point. He set the photo down and sighed deeply. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that this whole ordeal had changed him in ways he couldn't yet understand. The Jimmy who tended to his garden and mentored kids at the community center, that man felt like a stranger now. In his place was someone older, wearier, burdened by the knowledge that even the strongest bonds could break under pressure. Still, Jimmy knew he couldn't give up. He'd spent his entire life trying to make the world a better place, one small act of kindness at a time. If anything, this experience had shown him just how important that work really was. Maybe he couldn't fix everything or anyone, but he could keep showing up, keep doing what he believed was right. With that thought, Jimmy stood up and walked over to his bookshelf. He pulled out an old journal he used to write in during tough times. Flipping it open to a blank page, he picked up a pen and began to write. At first, the words came slowly, hesitant and uncertain. But as he poured his thoughts onto the paper, he felt a tiny spark of hope ignite within him. Maybe healing wouldn't happen overnight. Maybe forgiveness, both for himself and for others, would take time. But Jimmy knew one thing for sure. He wasn't ready to give up yet. Not on himself and not on the future. Whatever came next, he would face it head on just like he always had. The days following the sting operation passed in a blur for Jimmy. Life in Millfield slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But for him, things felt different. The quiet mornings spent tending to his garden no longer brought the same sense of peace they once did. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, offering kind words and updates on community events, but Jimmy found it hard to engage fully. His mind kept wandering back to the warehouse, the flickering light, the tense standoff, and the look in the other person's eyes when everything unraveled. It wasn't guilt that weighed on him exactly. He knew he'd done what he had to do. What bothered him most was the realization that people could change so drastically, sometimes without you even noticing. Someone who had once been a part of his life, someone he cared about deeply, had become entangled in something dangerous and destructive, and now because of their choices, Jimmy's world had been turned upside down. One afternoon, as Jimmy sat on his porch sipping coffee, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was plain with no return address, but his name was written in familiar handwriting. For a moment he hesitated, staring at the envelope like it might bite him. Finally, curiosity got the better hand, and he opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter, short but heartfelt. The words were simple, but they hit Jimmy like a punch to the chest. "I'm sorry," it began. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I made mistakes, so many mistakes, and I didn't think about how they would affect anyone else, least of all you." Jimmy read the letter twice, each word sinking deeper into his heart. There was no excuse for what had happened, and the letter didn't try to offer one. Instead, it was raw and honest, filled with regret and pain. As much as Jimmy wanted to dismiss it, he couldn't deny the sincerity behind the words. This wasn't the voice of someone trying to justify their actions. It was the voice of someone desperate to make amends, even if it was too late. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, setting it aside on the table. For hours he sat there, staring out at the street, lost in thought. The letter stirred up emotions he hadn't fully processed yet. Anger, sadness, frustration, but also a glimmer of hope. Could forgiveness really be possible after something like this? Or was it just wishful thinking? Later that week, Jimmy decided to visit the community center where he volunteered. He hadn't been there since before his arrest, and the kids greeted him warmly, eager to hear stories from his time in the army. At first, Jimmy felt out of place, unsure if he still had anything meaningful to share. But as he began talking, he realized that some lessons never lost their relevance. "Life is full of tough choices," he told them, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Sometimes those choices can lead us down paths we never intended to take. But no matter how far you stray, it's never too late to turn things around. You just have to be willing to face the consequences of your actions and learn from them." The kids listened intently, nodding along as Jimmy spoke. Some asked questions about his own experiences while others shared their own struggles. Listening to them reminded Jimmy why he loved working with young people so much. They were resilient, hopeful, and hungry for guidance. Being around them reignited something inside him, a sense of purpose he thought he'd lost. After the session ended, one of the teenagers approached him. "Mr. Thompson," she said shyly, "do you ever feel like you've messed up so bad that there's no way to fix it?" Jimmy smiled softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Everyone makes mistakes," he replied. "Even me. The important thing isn't avoiding mistakes altogether, it's learning how to deal with them, owning up to them, making things right where you can, and moving forward. That's what matters." The girl nodded, looking relieved. As she walked away, Jimmy felt a small spark of pride. Maybe he couldn't undo what had happened to him, but he could still help others navigate their own challenges. In a way, that gave his pain a purpose. That evening, Jimmy sat down at his kitchen table again, pulling out the old journal he'd started writing in after the sting operation. He flipped through the pages, reading over the entries he'd scribbled in the past few days. Some were angry, others sad, but all of them were honest. Writing had become a form of therapy for him, a way to untangle the jumble of emotions swirling inside. Tonight, though, he wrote something different. Instead of focusing on the betrayal or the sting operation, he focused on gratitude. He listed the things he was thankful for: the support of his neighbors, the opportunity to mentor kids at the community center, the chance to rebuild his life after such a difficult chapter. By the time he finished, his hands felt lighter, as if putting pen to paper had lifted some of the weight off his shoulders. As he closed the journal, Jimmy glanced at the envelope containing the letter. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Forgiveness wasn't easy, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to extend it completely. Not yet, anyway. But he realized that holding on to anger wouldn't bring him any closer to healing. If anything, it would only keep him stuck in the past. With a deep breath, Jimmy tucked the envelope into a drawer. He didn't need to decide right then whether to respond to the letter or let it go. What mattered was that he was taking steps toward moving forward. One day, one moment, one choice at a time. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jimmy stepped out onto his porch, watching, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of optimism. Life had thrown him a curveball, but he was still standing. And as long as he kept showing up, kept trying, he knew he'd find his way back to solid ground. Weeks turned into months, and life in Millfield continued its quiet rhythm. Jimmy had returned to his routines, tending to his garden, mentoring kids at the community center, and spending evenings on his porch with a cup of coffee. On the surface, everything seemed normal. But beneath that calm exterior, Jimmy was still piecing himself back together. The events of the past few months had left scars that wouldn't fade easily, but he was learning to live with them. One crisp morning, as Jimmy watered his plants, he noticed a flyer taped to the lamppost near his house. It advertised an upcoming town hall meeting about community safety. At first, he thought nothing of it. These meetings happened every now and then, usually drawing a small crowd of concerned residents. But something about this one caught his attention. The headline read, "Building Trust Between Law Enforcement and Citizens." Jimmy folded the flyer and tucked it into his pocket, unsure if he'd attend. He hadn't spoken publicly about what happened to him, not to the neighbors, not even to the kids at the community center. Talking about it felt like reopening a wound that was finally starting to heal. But as the days passed, the idea lingered in his mind. Maybe it was time to share his story, not for himself, but for others who might be going through something similar. The night of the meeting, Jimmy arrived early, taking a seat near the back of the room. The space filled up quickly, with people exchanging polite greetings and murmurs of curiosity. A local police officer stood at the front, flanked by a representative from the FBI. Jimmy recognized Agent Klein immediately. She gave him a subtle nod when their eyes met, her expression unreadable but kind. As the discussion began, the conversation focused on improving communication between law enforcement and the community. People shared concerns about racial profiling, misunderstandings during arrests, and the importance of transparency. Jimmy listened intently, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest of his chair. Each story resonated with him in some way, reminding him of his own experience. When the floor opened for comments, Jimmy hesitated. His heart raced as he weighed whether or not to speak. Finally, taking a deep breath, he raised his hand. The moderator called on him, and all eyes turned toward the back of the room. Standing slowly, Jimmy cleared his throat. "I'm Jimmy," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside him. "Some of you may know me. I've lived here for years, helped out at the community center, tried to do my part for the neighborhood." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "A few months ago, I was arrested for something I didn't do. Guns were planted in my home, and because of my background, people jumped to conclusions. I spent hours in handcuffs wondering if anyone would believe me." The room fell silent. Jimmy glanced around, seeing a mix of shock, sympathy, and understanding on the faces of his neighbors. He continued, "What happened to me wasn't fair, and while I'm grateful the truth came out, it made me realize how fragile trust can be, between us as a community and between us and those sworn to protect us." Agent Klein nodded encouragingly from the front of the room. Encouraged, Jimmy went on, "But I also learned that trust isn't built overnight. It takes effort, from both sides. I want to thank the officers and agents who worked hard to uncover the truth. And I want to remind everyone here tonight that we have a responsibility too, to speak up when things aren't right, to support each other and to keep pushing for change even when it's uncomfortable. By the time he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. Some people approached him afterward, thanking him for sharing his story. Others simply shook his hand or offered a warm smile. For the first time in months, Jimmy felt a sense of connection, not just to his neighbors, but to the larger purpose of rebuilding trust in their community. In the weeks that followed, Jimmy threw himself into new projects. He started organizing workshops at the community center, teaching kids conflict resolution skills and the importance of standing up for what's right. He collaborated with local law enforcement to host Q&A sessions where residents could ask questions and express their concerns openly. Slowly but surely, he saw progress. Conversations became more honest, relationships more genuine. One day, as he sorted through old boxes in his attic, Jimmy stumbled upon a dusty photo album. Flipping through its pages, he found pictures of happier times, family gatherings, holidays, moments of laughter and joy. One photo in particular caught his eye. It showed him alongside the person who had betrayed him, both of them smiling brightly under the summer sun. For a long moment, Jimmy stared at the image, his chest tightening. He couldn't deny the pain that memory still brought, but he also couldn't ignore the good times they'd shared. Setting the album aside, he realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about letting go of the bitterness that kept him tied to the past. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Jimmy felt a rare sense of peace. Life hadn't given him the answers he wanted, but it had taught him something valuable. Healing wasn't linear. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, and days when the weight of everything felt unbearable. But there would also be moments of light, small victories, unexpected kindnesses, and glimpses of hope. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes as the cool breeze brushed against his face. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but he was ready to walk it. After all, he'd spent his entire life helping others navigate their own challenges. Now it was his turn to take the lessons he'd learned and use them to rebuild, not just his life, but the lives of those around him. And so, as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Jimmy smiled softly to himself. Whatever the future held, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone.